Hello and welcome back to this channel. I'm going to be talking about teaching outdoors and the pros and cons of doing that and some things that you might want to think about. So, let's get into it. It was cold. Nice to be back inside with you. And there are several questions that have to be answered during this lecture. The questions are why, where, when, and how. This could be a long lecture. So the first question is why? Why would we want to record a learning activity in a location other than a classroom on campus or at some home office or home studio? Or why would we want to hold our lecture at some sort of other venue other than on campus? So for certain subjects, there could be very compelling reasons. I teach environmental studies, so there are a number of circumstances, parts of courses, maybe entire courses, where it would make a certain amount of sense to be in nature. And then, of course, there are other courses, other programs, other subjects, where it might be less obvious, less natural to hold some sort of learning activity outside of the classroom or outside of the home environment where you were teaching during the pandemic, or where you might be occasionally teaching after the pandemic. However, if we try to think about a generic course, a course that could be considered somehow typical for an average course at a typical university, what kind of reasons or reasoning could lead to the need to hold a part or complete learning activity being pre-recorded? Sorry about my cell phone there. I'll turn that off. Reason number one, you might want to add a certain flavor or a certain quality to a particular lecture or learning activity. I'll say lecture for learning activities from now on. We could have 30 seconds of something which could be clipped in the middle of a lecture or at some time during the lecture. That here I am in the classroom, or here I am now. I am presenting things with the PowerPoint, I'm writing things on the whiteboard, and this is being recorded, and then we are transported. We and the students are transported to some other place for 15 seconds, for 5 minutes, and the students are watching this as an integral part of the lecture. Or in the case that I'm about to show you, it starts off the lecture. So this is the very start of a pre-recorded lecture. Sociology can be seen as the study of society, the various institutions, the patterns that we see in collective behavior in society, structures in society, power and power relations, etc. I made this particular pre-recorded lecture in an otherwise about 50 minutes long lecture about sociology for students in the environmental studies program, and in particular for their course in environmental sociology. Sociology in general is an attempt to lift our view and look at society from a certain distance. Of course, we could concentrate on certain aspects, say class, ethnicity, and leave other parts of society outside of our focus. But whatever we choose to focus on, we are still interested in behavior in social circumstances, how this plays out in society in general, and the interactions of our focus on other parts of society. This picture is a way to summarize what sociology is. Reason number two, you might want to demonstrate something. You might want to demonstrate something outdoors. Specifically, you might want to interact with your surroundings. You might want to show something as an analogy or a metaphor. You can't take the students to exactly where they need to be, but you take them to a location which is similar. And you can take them there in a way that just talking about in a classroom is difficult to achieve. You could clip in those 5 minutes of taking them there. You could even, in fact, be silent and you could talk about it in the classroom. Let's look at an example of what I was doing. Here I am out in the cold. I'm actually in a nature preserve outside of where I live. And I'm introducing the idea of product life cycles and life cycle assessment tool, or LCA. Products and services are seen as temporary assemblages of materials. Just like anything that has a life, a product has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But actually, when you look at life cycle thinking and product life cycles, there are more stages than that. The consumer is the middle of the life of the product, with other stages in the life of the product being upstream. And in this lecture, I gesture upstream on this little stream here, such as the product, the raw materials being mined, the manufacturing processes. And still others like recycling, repairs, and waste management are downstream. Now, of course, I could have stood in the classroom and I could have said that, and I could even drawn on the board, but I spent a few minutes using this filming opportunity and clipped that into a lecture having to do with products and their environmental impact. And it required a little bit of time, a little bit of thought, but I suppose it was a bit more engaging than me just standing in front of a whiteboard and talking to the students. Again, it was a place where there was a flow of water, just like there would be the metaphor of a flow of materials in the life of a product. Reason number 3, you might want to demonstrate some object or something that the students might be using later in the course, or that they need to have some familiarity and skills using. Some sort of an object with dials and knobs, and that they need to know exactly how to use it. In this case, a small piece of lighting equipment that I just had to have here. What could this be? You could have a sound level meter instead. I don't have one here at home, so that I can demonstrate that as part of this lecture, but you get the point. Microphone, dials, and so forth, and recording, and how do you do this, and the different kinds of standards and ways of recording sound levels and the frequency distribution and so forth. I can record this. I could take the camera in different directions and show. I could have sounds. We could see what would happen. I could push the buttons. Of course, there's a manual, but not all students do as they should, read manuals. Or, say, a microscope. And again, I don't have a microscope at home to be able to demonstrate, but I could go to my campus and get one and make a film about how a microscope is used. If we pre-record a lecture about this, we give the students some kind of fundamentals about that, and we can actually show what we're doing, and we can record our use of the microscope from more than one angle, and we can stop the recording, and we can move the camera, and we can clip this into a 10-minute instructional video. And it takes us some time to do that. But on the other hand, once we've done that, unless we've changed the model of the microscope drastically, we may never have to do this again. And so it's been a long-term time saving for us. Or something else. I'm sure that some of you watching this can think of some objects, some tools, measurement devices that could be part of a course in your program, and that it could be useful to do this. And in fact, some people may have already done this prior to the pandemic, as the very small start of some kind of hybrid higher education teaching and learning. You might want to take your students with you to a particular location. Sure, there have been study visits and field trips that thousands of courses around the world in hundreds of universities have been using in the past. You rented a bus with a driver and you took all your students someplace, and in the morning you did something. It was a learning activity. The students ate lunch, you drove to a new location, you did something there, and then you returned to the campus towards the end of the day. That would be a possibility. And you could interact with the students, and if they had questions, and you could demonstrate things as the students were at the particular location, at that particular venue. However, if we instead pre-recorded something like a study visit but without the students, this could be a complement. We only have the possibility of going to 2 locations on one day. However, I can pre-record this and I can take my students with me to a 3rd location. And I could, in fact, even revisit the first 2 locations and go to the 3rd location and set it in some sort of a context. The students have been at 2 places. They might better grasp the 3rd place without actually being there. Finally, with regard to a study visit is another possibility. Let's imagine a distance learning course where the students are at home and they're never on campus, or a distance learning hybrid education kind of course where the students show up at the beginning of the course, have some intensive lectures, have some lectures pre-recorded or otherwise during the term, and at the end of the term they show up on campus again and they have an exam, or they present their results to each other, or submit their written report, or whatever it is. But we could imagine that, let's take an example, that a city park is something which is the object of study. And it doesn't have to be ecological and habitat, thinking about environmental studies. It could be how people use the park, how people are moving around in the park. It could be much more human oriented. And so I go to a particular park in my city, close to the campus, and I demonstrate to them what this park looks like and certain things that I want them to do in the park in their own city or whatever location it is. And based on what they've seen me do and the written description of the assignment, then the students choose a particular location and carry out their work there, and they write up their report about it. Much better to do that they can see me doing something similar than just getting the description of what needs to be done. Probably leading to deeper learning, better understanding, better appreciation, and so forth. And the uncertain students will feel less uncertain. You might want to have a large part, or perhaps your entire lecture, entirely outdoors. And then you are really bringing your students with you out to the location and showing them particular things. And why are you doing that? Well, it's because the lecture works better that way. When we are in a classroom, frequently we have our whiteboard behind us and we may be walking around talking and using the whiteboard to put up points. We might be doing calculations on the whiteboard and we might be describing how to do this, or we might be drawing diagrams. Or we might have a projector and our computer and a PowerPoint and show that. Or we might combine that. Or we might combine all kinds of things in this classroom situation. So I might be talking about a particular location and show snapshots of that location. That means I'm embedding the location in the room where I am with my students. Either I'm lecturing and it's pre-recorded, or the students are there and I'm lecturing for them. If we reverse this, we turn it somewhat on its head. Instead, I am embedded in the learning situation. I am embedded in the example, and I am walking around within the example and talking about it. That way I'm immersed, and it may be that the students feel more immersed in that situation, as opposed to me being at a distance and trying to get the students to be involved in some picture that I'm just showing. Surely it would be more engaging having an instructor walking around and talking about city planning, architecture, design, transport, habitats in urban environments for animals and plants, whatever it is, on site, as opposed to just showing pictures and talking about it. Of course, a sixth reason could be that you just might think that this makes things more interesting in general, that things are more engaging for the students. It is either more engaging or relevant for this particular lecture, this particular course, or that you are on this particular location serves as some sort of a backdrop, as one of several visits in several courses during an entire bachelor's program or entire master's program or whatever, which sort of adds a flavor or an atmosphere to the course. Or a combination of some or all of the above. So we can see that depending upon the program of studies, or the subject, the course, and so forth, there could be a varying number of degrees of compelling reasons to have parts of some learning activities, not only pre-recorded, but pre-recorded outside of the classroom and pre-recorded outside of the home studio, or wherever you normally do that. And while it is a requirement of some sort of investment in time and thinking and lesson planning and so forth, and you might come to see holding a lesson in a somewhat different way because you have to reorganize this, thus becoming a learning activity for yourself, it could be beneficial if it's possible to do this, and you invest now and get the resulting dividends and paybacks over, say, the next 3, 4, 5 times the course is held. You don't have to do this again, you always have it there. So welcome back, and now we have come to the where. After we have dealt with why, we come to where, and then we're going to do when and how. And the answer to the question to where, of course, is the specific location that you had in mind. Either that you are going to go there and stand with the tripod and deliver your lecture, or perhaps walk around with the camera and talk into the microphone and point out certain things. You're not visible, but other things are visible, or however you're going to do this. So you have a specific location in mind. However, you might want to have one or more alternatives in mind. And there could be a number of reasons for those alternatives being necessary. First of all, the location just might not be available right then. It could be closed off and you can't go there, or it is physically available but maybe not appropriate in the way you thought it would be. We could imagine, for example, that you were in the city and there was a particular area that you wanted to have as a backdrop when you were talking, and then you were going to pause and then you were going to walk around and film certain things, buildings or a square or so forth. And one or more of those locations could be along a street where the Department of Public Works in the city has decided to rip up all the asphalt and repave it. And so it's going to be very noisy. You might also discover that it isn't some special occasion or event which is causing you a problem. It could be that it's much noisier than you thought. You were always there in the middle of the day, there wasn't very much traffic, and now you were there at another time and there was a lot more traffic, and this isn't going to work. So you're going to have to move locations. Or it could be in a park and you thought you were going to be walking around and you were going to be filming what people were doing in the park as part of your lecture, and these fantastic oak trees that were behind where you thought you were going to have as a backdrop, the city is taking out some of the limbs and chopping them down right there and then at that time. These things can happen. Or there are a number of construction vehicles that have pulled up and have parked right where you thought you were going to show a vista down a street. Well, you might just have to accept that they're there, even though there's no noise that's coming from them. So you're going to want to have a plan B, and you might want to have a plan C. So when it comes to a plan B and a plan C, you might need an alternative but similar location. And for you to be able to have a backup plan, you have to have some familiarity with it. Unless you're a very spontaneous and very impatient person, in which case you might just do whatever you want or just pick a location that might not be the best, but it's better than being in the classroom for whatever reason, about answering the question why. Now all of this means that, again, unless you're very spontaneous or very impatient, all of this means that there is a certain amount of what is sometimes referred to as pre-production. When it comes to making short films or presentations like this, and in a semi-commercial or in fact a commercial way, we have a period of pre-production, we have the actual production, and we have post-production. And in pre-production, we're talking about the planning, we're talking about the location scouting, we're talking about any kind of preparation of a script, even if that just looks like maybe a PowerPoint presentation with bullet points that you're using when you're speaking. And preparation, of course, is bringing everything that you need with you if you are going to have something more elaborate. Then we have the production itself, which is what I'm doing right now. And I have my script down below me, out of view. Issues that arise along the way. For example, the pause when I talked about plan B and plan C, that was because the battery was running low, and I paused and I continued. And then post-production is when you have the various takes of 5 or 10 minutes long, and you pause and you stop, or you say too much and you cut that out in an editing program. Those kinds of things. And perhaps you add something like text, like you see me add here and there, or a picture or something like that. That is something which is more in post-production. And then, of course, it has to be made available to the students. That was the where. So now let's move on to the when. The first consideration I would suggest when it comes to when is that it's probably going to be daytime. If you were going to, it's probably going to be daytime. An alternative, of course, would be that you would be outside at night. And in that case, you would need to have a certain amount of extra light with you, and it might not end up all that good anyway. On the other hand, maybe for your particular lecture or part of a lecture, it makes pedagogical sense to record all or some of the lecture outdoors at night with poor lighting conditions. I probably wouldn't do that. You might have a compelling reason to do that. But bear in mind, in all likelihood, very simplistic equipment that you have is just not going to be able to do the job. You're going to have equipment, lenses, cameras that can deal with those kinds of low light conditions, and you would probably need to have, at the very least, some sort of small lighting source like this, which probably wouldn't be enough unless you had it just shining directly here. You'd probably need to have something considerably bigger. Next up, the weather. It should not be raining, it should not be snowing, and it shouldn't be too windy. If you do have some sort of wind protection, these are sometimes in the film world called dead cats, or if they're very small, dead kittens. Here we see a dead cat on a microphone, and it's very small, it's a dead kitten. Sorry, those are the terms that are usually used, because nobody says wind protection, cover, etc. like that. I'm not advocating that we go out and kill a lot of animals. Now some of my equipment is weather resistant, or sometimes this is referred to as weather sealed. Some kinds of system cameras might even have an IP number attached to them, and that they're really certified that they can manage this. This doesn't mean that you can take your camera and put it in a bucket of water, but it does mean that you don't have to worry about if there's a drizzle. You're recording something and it starts to light rain. Then you can decide, am I going to continue, or am I going to finish the equivalent of a paragraph or a page or whatever it would be, and then turn it off and wait and when the rain is over, or I continue someplace else where the rain isn't a bother. So my equipment is also, some of it at least, not only is weather resistant, it's dust resistant, and can manage temperatures as low as -10 Celsius. And for those of you who prefer using one of those archaic kinds of temperature scales, that's 14 Fahrenheit. I'm contributing this to the American audience and the Liberian audience, who are unique compared to the rest of the world. Next matter, what I'm going to call exposure, and I don't mean photography or videography exposure and ISO sensor sensitivity and so forth. What I'm talking about is that you're going to be outside for a while. Let's assume for a moment that your lecture is 45 minutes long and 15 minutes of that is going to be outside. The rest is going to be inside for whatever reason. Now, you're going to have to arrive on location and you're going to be there. You might have to stand and wait because there are people walking by and you don't want all that many people there, or that doesn't matter. It might be a bit windy, not so windy that you can't record, but it might be a little chilly, and so this is not enough to have on. And you might, this might be your first time and you make mistakes and you have to shut it off and then you have to start again and so forth. And what happens, those 15 minutes could, in the worst possible case, maybe take 45 minutes. So you have to say to yourselves in this circumstance, can I be outside given the elements, the exposure that I have to it? Now that sounded like being cold. Well, maybe it's a place that's very hot. Maybe there's no shade. Maybe you're going to be there for a much longer period of time. Maybe you're planning on being outside for an hour and a half. You don't want to get sunburned. You don't want to get too hot. Maybe you don't want to have a sun hat on because it casts a shadow on your face. I don't know, but something to think about. An additional matter, you probably don't want to be recording yourself in the dark shade on an otherwise very bright day, because you might come across as being seen as very dark and very hard to see. So, on the other hand, you probably don't want to be in the middle of a bright, sunny day in the summertime, because then your face may appear very washed out, and you might not want that. If you're going to go all the trouble to do all this that I'm suggesting that you might want to do, you could very least make sure that these conditions are not working against you, and you choose a particular time of the day where it works better. Even though I've been talking about lecturing outdoors, well, here I am standing indoors. It seems sort of like a paradox or ironic that most of this lecture is, in fact, indoors. When I was talking about not recording during a bright sunny day, some photographers and videographers don't like, professional photographers and so forth, avoid the middle of the day, bright sunny sky, and the summertime, because they consider this to be bad light or harsh light. The sun is high in the sky, there are unusual shadows or no shadows at all, things may appear washed out. That may mean that the photographer, the videographer, has to spend a lot of time in post-processing and adjusting things instead of just saying, oh, that was a good picture, or that was a good take, a good shoot, and I don't have to do any kind of editing of it. So a general idea, and what I tend to do, is I try to avoid the middle of the day and choose mid-morning or mid-afternoon, and on a day which is mostly sunny, partly cloudy. Potentially overcast, but if it is very thick clouds and overcast, that might not be so good either. You'll just have to C. All this, of course, depends upon your distance from the equator, the season of the year, and your personal preferences. Finally, one last matter. You probably don't want to do this during close to sunrise and sunset, because there can be quick changes in the lighting that's around and you have to stop and maybe move the camera and move yourself. And of course, if it's close to sunset, then you may rapidly lose the amount of time that you can carry out your lecture. On the other hand, maybe you want this. Maybe you want to demonstrate something having to do with light and safety in a city, or street illumination. All this connected to city planning and architecture, say. And maybe you want to start your recording 20 minutes before sunset and continue talking, and things start to get darker and the street lights start coming on. And that was what you wanted to have as something that you couldn't have in a classroom. I don't know. Maybe that's what you want. Maybe that's what you need. So when we are outdoors, or wherever it is, we probably don't have a lectern like we would normally in a classroom, where we can have our laptop and connect it to the projector, and we can have papers you want to distribute for an assignment. Okay, whatever. I don't have a lectern. I don't have a high table like the one I have here, which is sort of like a bar table, an excellent height to use if you're recording lectures indoors. The other option, of course, is to have a desk which you can raise and lower electrically, or if you're really desperate, an ironing board at its highest level. Anyway, you're going to have to put your lecture notes someplace, or you have a fantastic memory, or you're just going to ad-lib your entire lecture. And of course, you could have them like this, just out of the picture, and occasionally look down at them. But let's assume for a moment that you want to have them spread out on something. Well, I go for large 80 centimeter high rocks or higher. And then, of course, I mount the tripod and the camera on the reasonably flat rock, and I can have the paper in front of me, and if necessary, have 2 stones to make sure they don't blow away. You could have a bench. You could have a picnic table. They're very good. Because that way you can have the camera on the picnic table, and you can have your papers there as well. And if you get tired of standing and lecturing, then you can sit on the bench and move the camera a bit away and lower it, and then you can sit for a while. When I talked about location scouting before, we see how this comes into consideration. Not only do you have to be considering noise, and you may be hearing that there's a garbage truck which is outside collecting recyclables and non-recyclables, but I'm just keep talking about this. You also need to consider the setup, what you're going to do in the particular place. So besides the weather and the time of day, where are you going to put your notes? Where are you going to stand? And then when you're all set up, you might need to start adjusting the focal length on your camera or whatever, and then pushing the start button after you've set everything up and everything is ready to go. Now, I have an advantage of being an instructor in environmental studies, because sometimes out in nature that's a nice backdrop to be able to use, and I can find a place which has these kinds of what we should call recreational furniture that might be available. Or I might be able to find a large rock or whatever that might be able to be useful. And I'm talking about a really serious 1-ton kind of rock someplace that I can put things on. If you have another subject, you might need to have another kind of strategy, but obviously there are urban locations where there are plenty of benches and other things that would be possible. So that might be also part of your scouting. activities. And you might find 2 or 3 places on your campus or whatever location it is that you think of that, well, this is a place I want to return to record at least part of my lecture or part of my lectures. Now, another possibility is that you have your script either as text like this, or and in that case I usually have it in Times Roman 14, so that it's a little easier to see. On the other hand, maybe you use PowerPoint and you have bullet points and you use that to jog your memory what you're going to talk about next. If I don't have any particular place where I can spread out my notes, then what I usually do is this. I have a very large bag. It's sort of what we could call a canvas bag. It comes from the American company called L.L. Bean. I don't remember what it's called. I've had it, or my wife and I have had it for many years. And when I'm going to be carrying lots of things, and my camera backpack isn't enough to carry some of the things, maybe I've put a tripod and other things in the bag. So when I'm on site and I am reading from my script and I'm reaching the point where I don't want to have that paper anymore and I want to go on to the next one, then what I do is I take the paper out of sight and I drop it into the bag, hopefully. Now that way it doesn't blow away if everything gets in the bag and I have it all collected there, and I can look through it again and see if I missed something, so that I maybe can record an extra minute and splice and clip that into my presentation. So I said this is sort of a paradox or ironic that most of this lecture about lecturing outdoors is being done indoors. So I think we need to change that. So the weather turned out to be rather bad today, but it's been bad weather for a number of days. And the forecast calls for not such great weather during the coming days. So I just have to get out and I have to make the best of the situation. Here I am near the pedestrian street, and that's rather appropriate for this next part of the lecture. If you're going to be recording outdoors, sooner or later people are going to perhaps disturb you, and you might be more or less easily disturbed. There'll be people that might come by, might be looking at you while you're doing this, and there might even be people coming up and asking you, what are you doing, why are you here, and so forth. The worst possible thing, of course, is if you're flying your drone and somebody comes up and wants to talk to you, or even question you about whether you're allowed to fly your drone there. So I think what you need to do is that you need to go into some kind of a bubble, shall we say. That you need to sort of mentally seal off the surroundings around you and pay as little as possible attention to people who are going by. Well, it's quieter here, but it's starting to rain. Not exactly my plan. Anyway, I'm not in the middle of the woods someplace. The closest I can get to being in downtown Lund, in the medieval center of the city. But my experience, just as we saw in the center of the city that there are people that could walk by and disturb you, whenever I am, because of teaching in environmental studies, whenever I am outdoors in a nature preserve serving as a backdrop, or perhaps there's something there in that particular location that is necessary to show the students, and why not do it that way? What happens is that I find a location, I'm not on a trail, I'm not on a path, like this path we're seeing here, and I begin to set everything up. And what happens? Nobody's there. and then everything's set up, and I start the recording, and out of the forest, out of nowhere, come people walking their dogs. There are families or groups of families with loud and complaining children, or perhaps the children are relatively quiet, but it is the adults, the parents, who are very loud and very talkative because they think they're in the woods and they're not disturbing anybody, and they come around the corner and whoops, like that. So when it comes to being out in nature someplace and holding a lecture, and you find a secluded spot where you figure that nobody's going to be for a while, and then as you start, people show up. I think this seems to be, just like there's Murphy's Law and there are others laws like that, this is Straw's Law of lecturing in the woods. Wherever you pick a spot where you think it'll be secluded, and as soon as you start, people are going to come by and be in your way and walk between you and your camera. Really raining now. It's a good thing that all of the equipment I have out are weather sealed or weather resistant, so it's okay. Previously you saw where I had, in a lecture about sociology, I had clipped in as embellishments and as the start of a lecture where I was using my drone, or I was filming people in a square walking around in a pedestrian street to talk about sociology and what is sociology, and sociology is the science of society, or whatever definition we want to use for that. What I'm going to be showing you shortly is where the pre-recorded lectures outdoors form the bulk, the vast majority of the lecture. I made a mini-series of lectures having to do with nature protection. 3 lectures that one follows the other, and the students could watch that at their leisure at any time they wanted to, and then when they'd watched all that, we would have a question and answer session. So in the one clip you're going to be seeing, I am at a campsite in a nature preserve area or nature protection area, and I'm sitting on a bench of the kind that you would have around a campfire, and I have my notes in front of me, and I have my camera mounted in front of me, but at a much lower height because I'm sitting. And then in another clip you'll see I am standing and I have a picnic bench in front of me, and I have the tripod and the camera mounted on the picnic bench and papers in front of me. And I'm talking about classification systems for nature protection. So let's go to that. The more you feel like you are away from humans. I would like to introduce the word wilderness here in this lecture. Maybe this is actually what we mean by nature. If nature is the opposite to what is artificial and to what is cultural, then human impacts and human artifacts, objects, are very few, if at all, existing in wilderness. There is no human organization in the wild. Humans are very small creatures in a very large ecosystem, and there's nothing to say that the individual human might survive all that long in the wilderness. We have our clever artifacts, but they become quickly useless in wilderness. Could it be that there, several hundred years ago, there was a lot more nature, and there was definitely more wilderness? But now, as both the space for nature, whatever that is, and wilderness is narrowed, our experiences of and understanding of what it means to be nature and what it is meant by wilderness has become poor. And so we have 2 types of nature now. One which we could think of as a domesticated nature, one that is tamed, and one that is wilderness. In the former case, we are fooled into thinking that it is nature, while at the same time the area which is actually true wilderness is becoming smaller and smaller as humans encroach on those areas and directly or indirectly determine the flows of nutrients and the existence of animals and plants and the biodiversity in the area. That sounds a bit pessimistic. Sorry about that. Of course, there are examples where humans have let domesticated nature go. One of the things that the IUCN has done is that they have established what is referred to as the Protected Area Management Categories. It's a system to classify protected areas of nature according to one of 7 different kinds of levels of protection, where the highest level, 1A and 1B, afford the most amount of protection for nature is that different countries will sometimes say that they have a nature preserve, a national forest, a national park, and so forth. And we might think, oh, when they say national park, it means this. But the IUCN says, but wait a minute, what is called a, say, national park in one country may not have as much nature protection as a national park in another country. So in the first clip, I'm seated on a low bench at a camping site. I'm holding my script, although it's out of camera, glancing, at least I think it was, glancing at it as I was needed, and just as I might be if I was in a classroom on campus, lecturing in real life with students in front of me, or engaging in some kind of educational activity. My camera is on a tripod mounted in front of me. In the second clip, I'm standing by a picnic bench and a picnic table, and I have my camera on a tripod on the picnic bench. I have some papers spread out in front. Yes, and I'm using that as my script. I just realized today while doing some of these recordings that I've never really recorded myself recording, and which is something that I decided I would do when I was in the center part of Lund by the pedestrian street to talk about the surroundings and how you can be disturbed by your surroundings and people walking by. In both cases, in both the clips you saw about nature protection, I added around me text afterwards in a video editing program. And then when everything was ready, I took the different parts and I clipped it all together. Actually, I clipped the different parts together and I added on the text afterwards. But anyway, so I was in a location which was suitable and relevant for the lecture. So what we see in those two lectures having to do with nature preservation, or those two clips, is that I, as a lecturer, am embedded in the lecture. So I have taken the students with me to a location. I am embedded in the location, and the equivalent of the PowerPoint presentation is overlaid on top of that at the very end. What would it be like in the classroom instead? Instead, in the classroom, I would be standing at a distance from the PowerPoint projector. I would be at a distance from the students. The students would be looking at the PowerPoint. The students would be looking at me. They might be doing something else, I don't know, daydreaming. But most of the students would be presumably following with me. But we would both be at a distance to the object that that I was talking about, and I was also at a distance to the object. When I have pre-recorded, and this could be an example in other kinds of subjects other than environmental studies, when it is pre-recorded, we combine into one package the text in the form of text either around me added afterwards, or I can pause and I could clip in a PowerPoint picture in the editing and then remove that if I needed to. The subject, in this case nature protection, and the lecturer, they are all together in one. Again, that worked for certain nature protection kind of lectures, but we can think about architecture, we could think about city planning, we could think about, in some cases, maybe logistics. There are a number of different subjects at a university, besides my speciality of environmental studies, that could easily lend itself to this, and where a handful of pre-recorded lectures produced on site could be of pedagogical use and advantageous for students and also advantageous for the instructor. So some of these things might be difficult to achieve in a traditional classroom on campus. And this is an example of something which I hope will be permitted to live onwards after the pandemic, that I and others can continue to have a small number of produced pre-recorded lectures. And so what we see is we go from a pre-recorded lecture, which is that the instructor has the script, puts the camera up on the tripod, takes some distance, turns on the PowerPoint projector on the screen, or has a whiteboard behind is going to write things, and starts talking and so forth like that. And then maybe pauses occasionally because they said too many times, or there just needed to be a break, and then continue. And then this is quickly put together and loaded up for students to look at. In the case that I'm talking about here, it is less a pre-recorded lecture and more of a video production, which just happens to be a lecture or other kind of learning activity. Think about that. It's not just a pre-recorded lecture, it's a video production. That has pedagogical ramifications, technical ramifications, time, and also the strategic development of courses and so forth in a given department. So in the classroom, I function more as an intermediary between the students and, shall we call it, the text, not the book text, the text, the message, I want the students to understand their perspectives, the facts, and so forth like that. And they are not being immersed in the entire situation where I, the lecturer, immerse myself in the setting and I'm lecturing in a relevant location for the lecture. So, that was a very long lecture, or perhaps I've decided when I'm editing everything together that I'll make it into 2 lectures of approximately equal length. If you decide to click the like button, don't do that just for the dopamine hits of me seeing the likes. Well, okay, you can do that too. But if you understand the logic of social media, people who are viewing any kind of platform in social media, the audience needs to occasionally give it a like. It doesn't really matter how good or bad the content of Instagram or YouTube is. The algorithms decide based on the audience interaction with the material which is on the internet. Besides liking, you might also consider giving me a comment. What could those comments be? Perhaps constructive criticism, perhaps some sort of comment about something you've learned, or perhaps suggestions for future topics on this channel. That will be very much appreciated, particularly the latter. Consider sharing this video with others. I'm sure that you know at least a handful of your colleagues in your university and in other universities who might find that some parts of this and other lectures on this channel can be of benefit, even if the pandemic is over, or we believe that the pandemic is over. There is the new normal in the future, which might involve some kind of video production connected to our teaching. Finally, there's the matter of subscriptions. All YouTube channels, very small ones like this one, or very large ones with hundreds of thousands of followers, not only likes and comments, but also subscriptions. As I said with regard to likes, on YouTube, it isn't the actual quantifiable quality of the content which is important. It is the subscriptions, the likes, the comments. This tells YouTube that the audience, you, think that this is good content, and therefore YouTube is more likely to suggest this content for other people. So YouTube uses the likes, comments, and subscriptions as a surrogate measure of the quality of the content on any given kind of channel. And the only way that this works is if you like, comment, and subscribe. Maybe my channel is good. Maybe parts of it are good. Maybe parts of it are not so good. But you have to decide. But it's the decisions taken by you, the audience, that let YouTube know.